I'm looking at the table between us right now, and the sheer physical mass of the source material we've pulled for today is honestly staggering.
It really is. I mean, we are buried in paper here.
Right. We've got raw, minute-by-minute battle damage assessments from the Institute for the Study of War. We're looking at these dense, highly speculative strategic forecasts from the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
Not to mention the heavily redacted transcripts from the emergency UN Security Council sessions.
Exactly. And layered on top of all of that is a relentless fire hose of global news wires. Reuters, The Guardian, regional Middle Eastern outlets. The data is moving so fast that, well, half of these printed reports are practically obsolete by the time the ink dries.
It is a phenomenal amount of noise to filter through. Because what we're witnessing isn't just a military escalation. We are watching a foundational pillar of global geopolitics being dismantled and actively rewritten in real time.
Yeah.
The pace is exhausting, even for seasoned analysts, which is why synthesizing this stack into a coherent strategic picture for you is so critical.
And that is exactly our mission today. We are going to unpack the unprecedented, rapidly escalating U.S.-Israel war against Iran that erupted just days ago on February 28, 2026.
A date that's going to be in the history books.
Without a doubt. We're going to decode the military doctrines currently being executed in the airspace over Tehran. We'll analyze the sudden, massive leadership vacuum inside the Iranian political establishment.
And we have to map out the immediate economic shockwaves hitting global energy markets.
Because we need to figure out what this fundamentally means for you. This is not some abstract, over-the-horizon conflict. The ripple effects are already tearing through global supply chains, energy infrastructure, and frankly, the geopolitical stability of the world you navigate every day.
But before we get into the timeline and the tactical breakdown, we really need to pause and set some very clear parameters for how we are going to navigate this material.
Yes, absolutely. Because our sources today cover an active, highly politicized global conflict involving highly polarized viewpoints from both right-wing and left-wing political figures, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking any sides.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of any political figures, governments, or military actions mentioned.
Our sole mission is to impartially report on the factual content provided in the original source material and help you understand the complex ideas contained within them.
We are operating strictly as your guides through this intelligence data. We're taking the claims made by all actors, stripping away the rhetoric, and examining the strategic rationale and the objective realities on the ground, exactly as reported by the sources in front of us.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today is Friday, March 6, 2026. We are formally on day 7 of a massive joint military campaign.
Day 7. It feels like a lifetime already.
Doesn't it? The Pentagon is operating under the designation Operation Epic Fury, and the IDF is executing Operation Roaring Lion. And, a week ago, the security architecture of the Middle East functioned on a completely different set of assumptions than it does at this exact second.
The paradigm shift here is absolute. For the last 2 decades, Western engagement with Iran, regardless of the administration in Washington, has fundamentally been about containment.
Right. Managing the threat.
Exactly. It was about managing the threshold. Whether you look at the architecture of the JCPOA, the economic strangulation of the maximum pressure campaigns, or even the shadow war of targeted assassinations and cyber attacks, the operational ceiling was always the degradation of specific capability.
Like slowing down the centrifuges.
Slowing down the centrifuges, disrupting the ballistic missile supply chains to proxies. But what the ISW and FPRI assessments are highlighting today is a violent rupture of that precedent. Containment is dead. The stated objective is now explicit, uncompromising regime change.
I mean, I'm reading the direct quotes from U.S. President Donald Trump's March 6 social media posts, and the language is stark. He is demanding Iran's, quote, unconditional surrender.
All caps.
All caps. He's entirely taking the concept of a negotiated off-ramp or a diplomatic ceasefire off the table. He is stating that the bombing will not stop until the current clerical establishment in Tehran completely capitulates.
It's a maximalist position.
It is. But looking at the FPRI's analysis of this Make Iran Great Again, our MEGA doctrine he's proposing, I have to ask, how does the administration actually expect this to work in practice?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Because the doctrine promises massive Western-backed economic reconstruction, but only if Iran installs what the president terms great and acceptable leaders. That feels less like a military strategy and more like an attempt to wish a new government into existence.
It's an incredibly high-stakes gamble on psychological warfare and internal fracture. The administration's theory of victory, if we analyze the internal logic of the mega doctrine, rests on the assumption that the Iranian populace and the peripheral power structures are so exhausted by economic isolation and clerical rule that a massive application of kinetic force will shatter the state's internal cohesion.
So they're banking on an internal collapse.
Basically, yes. Trump actually elaborated on this in his CNN interview. He was attempting to lower the rhetorical temperature for the broader Iranian public by stating he doesn't inherently mind religious leaders, provided they are fair and just, and fundamentally pivot their foreign policy to treat the U.S. and Israel favorably.
But I'm looking at this Axios report detailing the administration's internal historical parallels, and I am deeply skeptical.
The Venezuela comparison.
Yes. The administration is explicitly comparing this strategy in Tehran to their approach in Venezuela back in January. They point to the U.S. military operation that captured Nicolas Maduro, which led to Washington dealing directly with his former vice president, Delcy Rodriguez.
Right.
They are projecting this idea that if you simply remove the top tier of the hostile leadership, a compliant, pragmatic successor naturally steps into the void to stop the bleeding. Does anyone at the FPRI actually buy that the Venezuelan model applies to the Islamic Republic?
Not at all. The analysts are waving massive red flags over that specific comparison.
Why? What's
Okay.
the main disconnect there?
Well, the FPRI assessment argues that conflating the political geography of Caracas with Tehran is a profound analytical failure. The Venezuelan model relies on a relatively traditional, albeit corrupt state military hierarchy, where the removal of the figurehead causes the remaining structure to seek self-preservation through negotiation.
But Iran isn't structured like that.
Exactly. Iran's architecture is entirely different. The state isn't just a government. It's a deeply entrenched ideological and economic behemoth. You are dealing with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
And they hold the actual power.
They do. They aren't just a military wing. They control a massive percentage of the Iranian economy, the telecommunications networks, the domestic security apparatus, and all those transnational proxy networks. You cannot neatly decapitate the clerical leadership and expect the IRGC to simply hand the keys to a Western-approved moderate.
And we are already seeing the nationalist immune system kicking in. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf's response was immediate and blistering.
Right, he leaned right into it.
He flat out rejected the surrender demand, leaning heavily into anti-colonial rhetoric. He said Iran's fate won't be determined by what he called Epstein's gang, warning that turning their leadership into martyrs would only ignite the region further. It seems like the explicit demand for a U.S.-approved leader is doing exactly what the FPRI feared. It's forcing the regime to project absolute, unyielding defiance.
Because it touches the third rail of Iranian political identity, which is sovereignty. Regardless of how unpopular the regime might be domestically, explicit external dictation of leadership selection instantly frames any potential U.S.-approved candidate as a neo-colonial puppet.
It's a kiss of death.
It really is. It strips them of any domestic legitimacy before they even take power. But we also have to examine the fragility of this mandate on the American side. This unconditional surrender posture is operating on incredibly thin ice domestically.
Right. The CNN and SSRS poll in our stack shows 59% of Americans disapprove of these strikes. And the political fracture is completely bipartisan, which you rarely see in early-stage foreign conflicts.
Usually there's a rally around the flag effect.
But not here. You have America First Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene openly rebuking the intelligence claims being used by the administration to justify the scale of the strikes. Then you pivot to the Democrats, and Representative Jim Himes is flat out calling this a war of choice.
Which accelerates the looming constitutional crisis over the War Powers Resolution.
That's a huge piece of this puzzle.
It is. Secretary of State Marco Rubio did the mandatory briefing for the Gang of Eight and transmitted formal notice within the 48-hour window. But he coupled that compliance with a statement, explicitly noting that no modern presidential administration fully accepts the constitutionality of the law requiring prior congressional approval for sustained military action.
Wow. So they're daring Congress to stop them.
Effectively, yes. You have figures like Senator Tim Kaine aggressively pushing back to reassert the legislative branch's war powers. So you have a doctrine demanding the total capitulation of a foreign adversary, being executed by an administration facing a highly skeptical public and an actively hostile Congress.
Which brings us to the kinetic event that actually triggered this entire geopolitical earthquake. Let's dig into the decapitation strike on February 28, because the scale of this specific operation is mind-bending.
It really was unprecedented.
The IDF deployed approximately 50 fighter jets to drop roughly 100 bunker buster munitions directly into a heavily fortified subterranean complex right in the middle of Tehran.
In a major metropolitan area.
Right. They completely obliterated the facility, and in doing so, they killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
It is the most consequential targeted killing in the Middle East since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and exponentially more disruptive to the state structure.
What are the intelligence reports saying about the strike itself?
Well, what the IDF intelligence reports indicate is that this underground complex is vast. It spans multiple city blocks with numerous disguised entry points. And crucially, despite the death of Khamenei, the IDF claims surviving senior Iranian military and political officials are still actively utilizing the surviving sectors of that same bunker network to manage their retaliation.
That's wild. They're still down there. And the death of Khamenei immediately triggered Article 111 of the Iranian constitution. We are looking at a profound succession crisis happening under active bombardment.
A nightmare scenario for any government.
Truly. The sources outline that an interim leadership council has taken over. This consists of President Masoud Pezeshkian, Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni-Ejei, and Alireza Arafi, a senior cleric from the Guardian Council. Their mandate is to hold the state together until the 88-member Assembly of Experts can select a permanent supreme leader.
But that constitutional process is entirely a facade for the brutal power politics happening behind the scenes. The Assembly of Experts doesn't operate in a vacuum. They operate under the shadow of the IRGC.
And what's the IRGC's play here?
The reporting from Iran International suggests the IRGC is applying crushing pressure on the Assembly to elevate Mujtaba Khamenei, the late leader's 56-year-old son.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and where the MIGA doctrine clashes violently with Iranian internal dynamics. Mujtaba is the hardliner's continuity candidate. He is deeply embedded with the intelligence and security apparatus.
He represents no change whatsoever.
Right. But President Trump has already preempted this. He publicly labeled Mujtaba a lightweight and stated explicitly that his ascension to supreme leader is unacceptable to the United States.
This is the ultimate geopolitical catch-22. The United States is demanding the installation of an acceptable leader as a prerequisite for halting the bombardment. But as we discussed with the FPRI analysis, the moment Washington signals that a specific Iranian figure is acceptable, that figure becomes politically radioactive inside Iran.
So there's no way out.
Exactly. If a moderate or a reformist were to emerge right now with tacit U.S. backing, the IRGC would immediately label him a traitor and launch a coup. So the U.S. demand for a selected, compliant leader is structurally incompatible with the reality of who holds the actual guns inside Iran.
You can see this tension playing out perfectly in the optics versus the reality. Look at the Friday prayers in Tehran. You have state television broadcasting thousands of people marching with Khamenei's picture, projecting this unbreakable, monolithic resistance against the West.
That's the public face.
But the leaked reports show absolute panic behind closed doors. We're seeing names like Hassan and Ali Khamenei being floated. They are the grandsons of Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of the Republic.
Royalty, essentially, in their system.
Exactly. They're being pitched as potential consensus candidates who might bridge the gap between the reformists and the principalists without immediately triggering an IRGC revolt or further U.S. escalation.
It's a desperate scramble to find a figurehead who can survive the internal power struggle while simultaneously providing a diplomatic off-ramp for the external war. But the space for diplomacy is shrinking by the hour because of the sheer ferocity of the kinetic theater.
Let's talk about that kinetic theater because the numbers coming out of the Pentagon regarding this air campaign are staggering. In just 7 days, the U.S. and Israeli coalition has struck roughly 2,000 targets across Iran.
2,000. In a week.
In a week. They have systematically dismantled over 200 Iranian air defense systems. We have the U.S. Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane, going on the record to declare that the coalition has achieved local air superiority.
And we really need to pause on that term, local air superiority, because it dictates the entire tempo of the war.
Break that down for us.
It means the integrated air defense system over western Iran and Tehran has been sufficiently blinded and degraded that coalition aircraft can operate with a high degree of survivability.
Meaning they aren't getting shot down.
Right. And the proof is in the airframes being utilized. In the opening hours of a campaign against a sophisticated adversary, you rely exclusively on low observable stealth platforms like F-35s or F-22s to bypass the radar nets and conduct sea aid, which is the suppression of enemy air defenses.
But they've moved past that phase.
Entirely. U.S. Central Command is now openly stating they are flying B-1 bombers into Iranian airspace.
Right, the B-1 Lancer. It's a massive, supersonic, conventional, heavy bomber. It has a huge radar cross-section.
You can see it on radar from miles away.
Exactly. You do not fly a B-1 over hostile territory unless you have completely neutralized the enemy's surface-to-air missile threat. The fact that B-1s are operating over Iran means the coalition is essentially bombing with impunity.
They have moved past suppression and into systematic destruction of strategic assets. Look at the naval targeting. They sank the Shahid Bagheri in the Gulf of Oman.
That was a huge blow.
It was a critical asymmetric asset. It was a converted commercial container ship outfitted with a 180-meter flight deck, specifically designed to launch long-range drone swarms far beyond Iran's borders.
And they took out a traditional warship too, right?
Yes, the Iris did not. They are systematically stripping Iran of its ability to project power outward.
Now, the rationale provided by Secretary of State Marco Rubio for this massive preemptive air campaign revolves around a concept he termed strategic immunity.
Strategic immunity.
Right. The intelligence assessments indicated Iran was churning out over 100 short-range ballistic missiles every single month. The argument from Washington was that if Iran was allowed to continue this production rate for another 12 to 18 months, their missile and drone stockpile would become so vast, so overwhelming, that any future military intervention to stop their nuclear program would result in unacceptable coalition casualties.
So they felt they had a closing window.
Exactly. The U.S. and Israel essentially decided to break the shield before the shield became impenetrable.
And the target list reflects a systematic dismantling of that shield and the infrastructure that supports it. They didn't just hit launch sites. They struck the Natanz nuclear facility in Esfahan province.
Going right after the nuclear core.
They obliterated the Hisa drone manufacturing plant. That's the primary facility responsible for the Shahid drones that have wreaked havoc globally. They even targeted the IRIB headquarters, the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, taking a direct sledgehammer to the regime's primary apparatus for internal propaganda and command and control communication.
But we have to talk about the human cost of stripping away the strategic immunity because it is devastating. When you are dropping hundreds of bunker busters on a densely populated metropolis like Tehran and hitting 2,000 targets nationwide, the civilian toll is going to be horrific.
It's unavoidable with that level of ordnance.
The Iranian Red Crescent is reporting over 1,230 people killed in Iran so far. And there is one incident in the Reuters wires that is particularly tragic. It was a strike on a girls' elementary school in the southern town of Minab.
That's awful.
Scores of children were killed. And what makes this infinitely more volatile is that U.S. military investigators have reportedly admitted they believe U.S. forces were likely responsible for that specific errant strike. Volker Turk, the UN human rights chief, is demanding an immediate, transparent investigation.
The humanitarian catastrophe is expanding far beyond Iran's borders, too. Look at the secondary theater in Lebanon.
Right, the IDF operations there.
The IDF has weaponized their air superiority to issue unprecedented, sweeping evacuation orders across massive sections of Beirut's southern suburbs. They are systematically leveling entire city blocks that they claim house Hezbollah weapons depots and underground intelligence headquarters.
And they took out a key figure there.
They've already killed Hezbollah's intelligence chief, Hussein Mekeld.
The civilian displacement is absolute chaos. Over 123 people killed in Lebanon, and upwards of 95,000 civilians have been forced to flee their homes overnight. You have thousands of people sleeping on the streets and public beaches in downtown Beirut because the infrastructure simply cannot absorb them.
It's a complete societal breakdown in those areas.
And the UN is severely warning that the scale and nature of these forced displacement orders likely violate international humanitarian law.
Yet, despite having their conventional defensive network shredded, Iran and its axis of resistance are not capitulating. They have recognized that fighting a symmetrical air war against the U.S. and Israel is suicide.
They can't win dogfights with F-35.
Never. So they have pivoted entirely to their core competency, which is asymmetric retaliation. They are leveraging whatever surviving missile and drone stocks they have to set the entire region on fire.
And the geographic spread of this retaliation is wild. The sources confirm that in just 1 week, Iran and its proxies have launched projectiles at 12 different countries.
12 countries in 7 days.
They are targeting any nation that hosts U.S. military assets or is perceived to be facilitating the coalition. They've fired barrages at the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar. They directly targeted the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, which is a critical hub for U.S. Air Force expeditionary operations.
And this asymmetric strategy is inflicting real casualties. U.S. Central Command confirmed that an Iranian drone strike penetrated the defenses at Camp Arif Jan in Kuwait.
It was a dark day for the coalition.
6 U.S. service members were killed and another 18 were seriously wounded. This highlights a terrifying reality of modern drone warfare. The coalition may have degraded Iran's launch capacity by 90%, but if a swarm of 50 cheap drones is launched and the air defenses intercept 49 of them, that one drone that slips through can still cause catastrophic lethal damage.
It's the ultimate asymmetric math problem. The defense has to be perfect every time. The offense only has to get lucky once. And Hezbollah is demonstrating their reach as well. They launched a Shahed drone that successfully struck the British Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri in Cyprus. The physical damage was limited, but the political message sent to Downing Street was massive.
It was a warning shot.
It essentially said, if you support this coalition, your forward operating bases are viable targets.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategic calculus of Tehran is crystal clear. They cannot win on the battlefield. Their only viable path to survival is extortion.
Extortion on a global scale.
Right. They need to impose such an unbearable economic and political cost on the United States' regional allies and on the global economy as a whole that the international community panics and forces Washington to halt the campaign. And their primary weapon for that extortion isn't a missile, it's a geographic choke point.
Which brings us to the economic shockwave, the mechanism that instantly translates a war in Tehran into a crisis in your daily life. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz.
This is where everyone listening needs to pay close attention.
For those tracking the data from Schroders, roughly 20% of the entire world's crude oil and liquefied natural gas flows through this narrow channel between Oman and Iran.
It is the single most critical vulnerability in the global energy supply chain. And as of this week, it is functionally closed.
Just completely shut down.
The IRGC understands their leverage. A senior commander stated bluntly that not a single drop of oil will leave the region. They are backing up that threat by utilizing surviving drone elements and fast attack craft to harass and strike commercial shipping.
They've already hit targets, right?
They hit the Honduras flag tanker Athenova, and they fired projectiles at a U.S.-flagged refueling tanker docked in Bahrain. The psychological effect on the shipping industry was instantaneous.
Nobody wants to sail $1 billion of oil into a war zone.
Exactly. The insurance premiums for traversing the Gulf have become prohibitive. And as a result, roughly 150 massive oil and LNG tankers are currently just sitting idle. They're stranded on either side of the strait, too terrified to attempt the transit.
The market reaction was violent. Brent crude oil prices immediately spiked from the low 70s past $84, hitting $92 a barrel. But the analysts are warning that this is merely the initial panic pricing.
It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Saad Al-Kaabi, Qatar's energy minister, issued a terrifying forecast. He warned that if this blockade holds, we are looking at oil spiking to $150 or potentially even $200 a barrel.
And Al-Kaabi's warning isn't just about ships being afraid to move. Iran is actively degrading the physical infrastructure required to process and load that energy in the first place.
Which makes it a long-term problem.
Exactly. They launched targeted drone strikes against Qatar's massive Ras Laffan industrial city, which is the heart of their LNG export capability, and Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery. This is the nightmare scenario for the energy markets.
Because you can't just flip a switch and turn it back on.
Right. Even if a magical ceasefire were signed tomorrow morning, the physical damage to those facilities means that restoring global energy exports to pre-war levels will take weeks, if not months, of complex engineering repairs.
So how does this actually hit the listener? Why should you care? Because when oil hits $150 a barrel, global inflation fundamentally breaks.
Everything relies on oil.
Everything. The cost to manufacture every good, the cost to transport every piece of food to your grocery store, the cost to heat your home, it all skyrockets simultaneously. We are already seeing governments taking emergency measures. Look at the Reuters wire from the Philippines.
That was a stunning report.
The government there is already drafting plans to mandate a 4-day work week and cut air conditioning in all public buildings strictly to manage the catastrophic surge in fuel costs. That is a government thousands of miles away, fundamentally altering the daily lives of its citizens because of a blockade in the Persian Gulf.
This raises a fascinating and deeply cynical point about the unintended consequences of global conflicts. Because while the economies of Europe, Asia, and the Americas are bracing for a devastating inflationary shock, one specific geopolitical player is experiencing an unprecedented, massive financial windfall from this exact crisis.
Right, the Russian irony. The Foreign Policy Research Institute dedicated a significant portion of their brief to this dynamic.
It's geopolitical judo.
It is. You have Russia locked in a grinding, financially exhausting war of attrition in Ukraine, isolated by Western sanctions. According to their internal financial documents going into 2026, the Kremlin had modeled their entire national budget on the assumption that they could sell their specific Urals blend of crude oil at roughly $59 a barrel.
But the moment the Strait of Hormuz was threatened, the global supply curve shifted violently.
And the prices went through the roof.
The panic pricing pushed the value of that Russian Urals blend well over $70 a barrel. It has injected a massive, entirely unexpected surge of capital directly into Vladimir Putin's war economy. And the true genius of Russia's position here is geographic. Their seaborne oil exports are entirely insulated from the chaos in the Persian Gulf.
Exactly. Because of the Western sanctions over Ukraine, Russia spent the last few years completely restructuring its export logistics. They rerouted their oil to the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and their Pacific ports, pivoting their primary customer base to China and India.
They built an entirely parallel system.
So while Saudi, Emirati, and Qatari energy is trapped behind the Iranian blockade, Russia is aggressively stepping into the void. Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak is already publicly broadcasting to Asian markets that Moscow is ready and capable of boosting supplies to cover the shortfalls. Russia is simultaneously capturing massive global market share and raking in premium prices, all because of an American-led war.
And the transactional nature of this relationship is incredible. In exchange for this geopolitical gift, the sources indicate the Kremlin is quietly providing real-time satellite targeting intelligence to Tehran, helping the IRGC track American carrier strike groups and regional assets.
So they are actively helping Iran without firing a shot.
Right. Russia has zero capacity or desire to intervene directly to save the Iranian regime. But they are more than happy to feed the fire, bleed the American military bandwidth, distract the global media from Ukraine, and bank billions of dollars in the process.
Which perfectly transitions us into the global geopolitical chessboard because the international consensus is completely fracturing under the weight of this economic reality. Look at the UN Security Council emergency session. It was called by French President Emmanuel Macron, and it just derailed into a stark display of global division.
The legal arguments being deployed are fascinating to watch.
How so?
Well, the U.S. and Israel are anchoring their entire diplomatic defense on Article 51 of the UN Charter, arguing that the preemptive strikes were a necessary and proportional act of self-defense against an imminent existential threat posed by Iran's missile buildup.
But Iran obviously sees it differently.
Conversely, the Iranian ambassador is flooding the zone with accusations of premeditated aggression and clear-cut war crimes, pointing specifically to the civilian infrastructure damage.
And the major powers are aggressively aligning based on their economic exposure. China and Russia have issued sharp, unequivocal condemnations of the United States. And for Beijing, this isn't just rhetorical posturing. This is a full-blown existential panic.
China is heavily dependent on that strait.
Absolutely. China imports a staggering 80% of its shipped oil from the Middle East, with a massive reliance on Iranian crude. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz directly threatens China's internal economic stability, which is the sole pillar of the CCP's domestic legitimacy.
But the real diplomatic crisis for Washington is the reaction of its traditional European allies. The economic terror of $150 oil is overriding their traditional security alignment.
They are breaking ranks.
Fast. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez broke ranks entirely, publicly calling the U.S.-Israeli strikes an extraordinary mistake. In Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz offered tepid support for neutralizing Iran's nuclear threat, but he dedicated the bulk of his statement to expressing profound terror over what he called the Syrian scenario.
The Syrian scenario. That phrase carries immense psychological weight in Europe.
It haunts European politics.
He is explicitly warning that the total collapse of the Iranian state structure won't lead to a neat democratic transition. It will lead to a brutal, fragmented civil war that unleashes millions of refugees toward the borders of the European Union, replicating the demographic and political crises of the 2010s on a much larger scale.
Even the UK, which is arguably America's closest military partner in this operation, actively using their bases in Cyprus to intercept Iranian drones, is buckling under the pressure.
Because of the domestic blowback.
Exactly. When the Deputy Prime Minister floated the idea of the UK joining the offensive strikes against Iranian launch sites, Tehran immediately threatened to turn Cyprus into an uninhabitable war zone. The domestic political backlash in London was instantaneous.
And the conflict matrix is threatening to expand beyond the Middle East and bleed into Africa. The security assessments are flashing red over the Horn of Africa. The U.S. maintains a massive footprint at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, housing over 4,000 personnel. The UAE operates strategic military facilities in Somaliland.
It's a highly militarized zone.
The strategic nightmare is this. What happens if the surviving IRGC leadership successfully orders the Houthi rebels in Yemen to fully integrate their operations with their new allies, the al-Shabaab militant group in Somalia?
If that axis activates, it fundamentally breaks global maritime trade.
It would be a total blockade.
Complete.
Yeah.
If the Houthis and al-Shabaab coordinate a sustained anti-ship missile and drone campaign, they can effectively choke off the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern entrance to the Red Sea.
Which means the Suez Canal becomes useless.
Right. If Iran holds the Strait of Hormuz and their proxies hold the Red Sea, the logistical arteries of the Eastern Hemisphere are severed. The supply chain disruptions we experienced during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic would look like a minor inconvenience compared to the total rerouting of global shipping around the Cape of Good Hope.
So what does this all mean? How do states adapt to this level of overlapping crises? Well, the FPRI report highlighted one of the most brilliant, opportunistic, and frankly surreal diplomatic maneuvers I had ever seen. They are calling it Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's drone diplomacy.
It is a masterclass in leveraging a crisis to rewrite your strategic value.
Set the scene for us. Why is Ukraine suddenly a player in the Persian Gulf?
The context is vital here. The wealthy Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, are currently under siege from Iranian-designed Shahid drones. Their defense architecture relies heavily on American-made Patriot missile batteries.
The gold standard for air defense?
True. But look at the economics. They are currently firing interceptors that cost upwards of $4 million apiece to shoot down drones that cost $20,000 to manufacture. It is an asymmetric equation that guarantees they will exhaust their Patriot stockpiles in a matter of weeks.
Enter Ukraine. For the last 4 years, the Ukrainian military has been the primary global testing ground for defending against these exact same Iranian-designed Shahid drones launched by Russia.
They know these drones better than anyone.
Zelensky looked at the panic in the Gulf and saw an opportunity. He publicly pitched a massive technological and strategic swap to the Gulf monarchies. He said, essentially, you have the American Patriot systems that Ukraine desperately needs to survive Russian hypersonic missiles.
And we have what you need.
We have the world's most advanced, battle-tested electronic warfare tactics, mobile counter-drone units, and acoustic sensor networks specifically designed to hunt and kill Shahid swarms cheaply.
It's an unprecedented proposal. Ukraine is offering to export its hard-won domestic counter-drone expertise and potentially deploy its veteran operators directly to the Gulf in exchange for the transfer of Patriot batteries back to Kyiv.
But practically speaking, can they actually pull that off?
The technical and political hurdles here are massive. Integrating ad hoc Ukrainian electronic warfare systems into deeply classified, U.S.-built, centralized air and missile defense networks is an engineering nightmare. Furthermore, transferring Patriot systems requires Byzantine U.S. export approvals.
But the geopolitical audacity is incredible. Zelensky announced that Ukraine has already received urgent requests for technical consultation from the U.S. military regarding Iranian drone tactics, and they are in active direct negotiations with 2 specific Gulf nations to deploy Ukrainian advisory teams.
They completely changed their leverage.
Ukraine fundamentally flipped the script. They shifted their international posture from being a permanent dependent constantly begging for aid to an active, highly specialized security provider capable of offering the exact tactical solution the Gulf states need to survive this war.
It's a profound demonstration of how rapidly statecraft evolves under pressure. But as we pull all these disparate threads together, from the backroom deals in Kyiv to the burning refineries in Qatar, we have to return to the core reality of the battlefield in Tehran.
Let's quickly synthesize the staggering scale of what has transpired over these 7 days. We are looking at a fundamentally decapitated Iranian leadership structure following the targeted assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei. We have an uncompromising American doctrine demanding total, unconditional surrender and the installation of an externally approved government.
A global energy crisis on the brink of detonation.
Exactly, with 150 tankers sitting paralyzed outside a blockaded Strait of Hormuz, threatening to push oil to $150 a barrel. And we have a deeply fractured international community where allies are terrified of state collapse and adversaries like Russia are quietly reaping massive financial windfalls.
From a purely tactical kinetic perspective, Operation Epic Fury has been devastatingly effective. The coalition has dismantled Iran's integrated air defense networks, sunk key naval projection assets, and degraded their ballistic missile launch capacity by perhaps 90%.
But war is more than just bombing targets.
War is ultimately politics by other means. The stated political objective, forcing a deeply entrenched, ideologically driven security apparatus, like the IRGC, to unconditionally surrender their sovereignty and accept a foreign-backed leader, remains a monumental, perhaps impossible, demand.
Which leaves us with a chilling concept to ponder as we conclude this deep dive. The sources mention Chancellor Merz's terror regarding the Syrian scenario. Let's build on that and apply it specifically to the unique geography and military structure of a fragmented Iran.
It's a terrifying thought experiment.
What happens if the United States achieves its maximalist military goal? What if the relentless, punishing bombardment finally causes the central clerical regime in Tehran to shatter completely, but as the FPRI warned, no acceptable moderate leader possesses the power to step into the void and control the state?
That is the abyss. Iran is not a monolith. It is a massive, incredibly diverse nation of over 85 million people, composed of complex ethnic and ideological factions. If the central command and control structure evaporates, the state doesn't transition to a Jeffersonian democracy.
It shatters.
It shatters. You would likely see the country fracture into fiefdoms. The surviving, highly trained, heavily armed remnants of the IRGC would become autonomous warlords controlling vast swaths of territory and economic infrastructure.
And what about their proxies?
Furthermore, their transnational proxy networks, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the PMF in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, would suddenly be operating completely untethered. They would possess advanced weaponry, but lack the strategic restraint previously imposed by Tehran.
And the most terrifying variable in that equation is the nuclear infrastructure. If the state collapses into a multi-decade civil war, you suddenly have an extensive network of uranium enrichment facilities, centrifuges, and stockpiles of highly enriched radioactive material lost in the fog of war.
The ultimate proliferation nightmare.
Imagine heavily armed, ideologically extremist warlords fighting for physical control over nuclear material. The mega-doctrine's demand for unconditional surrender is a strategic gamble that assumes Washington can control the political pieces once they violently smash the board.
History tells us otherwise.
The brutal historical precedent of the Middle East dictates that when you create a massive vacuum of power, it is rarely filled by a moderate consensus. It is almost always filled by something infinitely more violent and chaotic than what preceded it.
It is a geopolitical risk of generational proportions, and the fallout from these 7 days will unequivocally dictate the security architecture of the 21st century.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The sheer velocity of the information coming out of this conflict is overwhelming, but understanding the connective tissue, how a bunker buster in Tehran directly dictates the price of fuel at your local station, or how drone tactics in Ukraine are reshaping alliances in the Persian Gulf is absolutely vital. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the strategic logic beneath the rhetoric, and we will catch you on the next one.